My name is Roy Kruger, and I'm a member of the Adult Ed Committee. Just a couple of, I should say, welcome to the second class of a three-part series that Dr. Elaine Park is doing for us on the Beatitudes. Just a couple of housekeeping matters. We found out today, we're all learning at the same time. We promised you the notes from last week. They are on the website, and in the chat box, Jonathan, our office manager, has put the link there. It's a second page in, I guess. So the notes from last week and this week will be found in the same area as the actual recordings. And as you use the invitation, there's a link. It will be next week for the notes for next week's presentation. And I would remind you as we go through today, if you've got some questions, why don't you put them in the chat about at 10 o'clock-ish. Elaine will be opening up for questions, and you can unmute, raise your hand, and we'll try and make sure we get all your questions answered. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elaine.
Great, thanks very much, Roy, and welcome everyone to the second of our excursion into the Beatitudes. For those of you who were here last week, you may remember that we talked about Beatitudes in the Hebrew tradition, and we focused particularly on Psalm 1, which is the introduction to the Psalter and gives a very rich view of what it looks like to live the Beatitude, to the blessedness. And I had a couple of suggestions of things you might want to do to follow up. So before we move into the New Testament, particularly Matthew's Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, we could spend a couple of minutes to see if anyone has some follow-up, some things you may have written or thought about, or insights that arose from our discussion last week. So we'll spend just a couple of minutes on that and then move into Matthew. So anything that someone would like to comment on? Okay, do I see a hand?
Yeah, yes, I don't know why, but I keep being drawn to the comments about scoffers. I think during this political season, I think it's easy to be sure that you're so right. The arrogance of feeling that you're so right that you can totally ignore what the other side says. And that's actually a difficult thing, I think, to get through. But anyway, that was something that spoke to me that I've been thinking about.
Yes, thank you. And so often, in order to understand the positive dimension of living as disciples, we have to honestly look at the other side, that negative picture. And certainly scoffers was a problem in the ancient world as it is today, and in a particular way right now. So I think it's good to be aware of things to avoid as well as what to embrace to live the Beatitudes. So thank you. If there's, yes, please, Louise.
I think there's a tension between gratitude and privilege with Beatitudes. Why am I blessed and why is someone else seemingly not as blessed? So I think that's something to keep in mind, especially now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that reminds me, I don't remember if I told you about this 90-year-old woman that I visited with in Colorado this summer. And she said one of her prayers is every day she says, "Why, Lord? Why me? Why am I so blessed?" And rather than looking at the difficulties of being 90 years old and some health issues and family difficulties, she focuses on all of the blessings that have been given and focuses on gratitude and then outreach to those who haven't been so blessed. So thank you. That can often be a tension. Yes, Jackie.
That idea of why am I so blessed, we can then kind of flip that to the other meaning of the word that you talked about last week. Happy are those. So we would not say, we might say, why am I so happy? But it's easier to answer. We are happy, in that blessing of God. So
Yes, yes, thank you.
it helps us understand it differently.
Good, good. Yes, Janet and Doug?
Yes, Janet. I guess two things in relation to what Tom said, and also what I'm thinking, is that the kingdom of God in my life is not the same today as it was 10 years ago. And things are going to change as we go forward. It's not just now. And then in relation to what Louise said, when we were in Haiti on 2 different mission trips, the people in Haiti are happy. They sing, they help each other, they sleep half the night on the floor and then they exchange beds so somebody gets to sleep on a bed. Anyway, there is something about a joy that is interesting to observe, and people express it.
Thank you. And as a matter of fact, that comment, I think, is a perfect lead-in to talking about Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew. So if we could move there, and then if we want to, at the end of today's session, any further things from the Hebrew background as well as comments on Matthew. Let's go ahead and move to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's version of the Beatitudes. So I'm going to bring this screen share on, and I made it larger today, so I hope you're able to see it a little bit more clearly. So certainly the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount are those with which people are much more familiar. And when we look at Matthew's Gospel, a comment from Donald Sr., I think is significant. He says that Matthew wrote his Gospel for a segment of the early church that desperately needed a sense of identity with the past and some direction for facing an uncertain future. It can be helpful to be a little bit aware of the audience for whom this gospel was likely written. They were most likely a community of Jewish Christians or Christian Jews, whichever way you want to use that terminology, that they had a strong background in Judaism. And so when Matthew writes the gospel in his own narrative, as well as Jesus' teaching, it is totally immersed in the terminology, the theology, and the experience of Judaism. So if we think of the background that we saw last week in the Psalms, Psalm 1 that began with that beatitude, that ashereh, and that Psalm 1 set the tone for the entirety of the Psalter, so that what is said in Psalm 1 opens up a way of seeing blessing, how to live the life of blessing in all of the Psalms, as well as what things to avoid. So the audience that for which Matthew's gospel is written would have known about the Psalter and the Beatitudes there. And so Jesus, thoroughly immersed in the Jewish tradition, begins his own preaching the same way. He uses that notion of beatitude to start his first sermon, that sort of a model for all of the things that will follow. Maybe we might call it his inaugural address. And here's what he's giving to his community. And it teaches them how to listen to everything that he says. And everything that he says is in that context of beatitude. The way that Matthew describes the sermon is Jesus goes up on a mountain So that's already giving a connection with the Hebrew tradition. Just as Moses was on the mountain, and the mountains in the Hebrew tradition were a place of theophany and encounter with God, so too is this mountain the place of Jesus' teaching, that he begins also with a beatitude. So let's begin then with that first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. A number of years ago, I was teaching a college group, and we had been doing quite a bit of study, and they had a pretty good background. And one of the students said, I really don't understand this. Why would somebody be called blessed who doesn't have the Spirit? So this word spirit here in Greek, pneuma, that's the word that Luke uses, that's used in the New Testament tradition to talk about the Spirit of God. It's also a word that's used to talk about a person's individual spirit. You know, how we use that word similarly today, how our own energy, inspiration, connectedness with the Spirit of God is used. So this student said, you know, why would somebody who doesn't have any spirit be called blessed? Well, that isn't an unusual understanding. In fact, in this book called Jesus, A Pilgrimage by James Martin, he says that many Christians find it hard to appreciate this beatitude because almost any translation implies the opposite of what Jesus means. Poor in spirit. It sounds like, you know, you're dejected and lowly and have no spirit, either your own verve, your own energy, or connectedness with the Spirit of God. He goes on to say, several years ago during a Bible study class in a parish, I asked the group what they thought of when they heard the term poverty of spirit. A woman's hand shot up. Someone who doesn't believe in God. Well, obviously, if that's what it means, the person would not be called blessed. In fact, that notion of poverty of spirit means that my own spirit is not puffed up, is not included among those wicked sinners and scoffers that we heard about in Psalm 1. That rather than my spirit being the source of everything, that I think that it's all about me, that I rely on the Spirit of God. Couple of comments on your handout. Poor in spirit are those who acknowledge God as the ultimate source of power, life, and meaning in their lives. In fact, in the New Testament era, there were people who would use that phrase to describe themselves as being faithful to the tradition. In Qumran, for example, they would call themselves poor in spirit, meaning that they're not relying on themselves, but relying on God. So Martin and others talk about this phrase as having a paradoxical quality. To be poor in spirit is to be rich in faith, because I'm not relying on myself, but I'm relying on God. It indicates a person whose humility allows him or her to grasp the fundamental reliance on God. Sometimes when we look at the Beatitudes, we find particular people who exemplify that particular beatitude or particular virtue or way of being a disciple. And a person who, for me, exemplified poverty of spirit is Loris Bukola. Some of you who have perhaps been at other talks may remember that I've mentioned him before. Loris spent many years actually with ALS, and his abilities kept decreasing more and more. And he writes about what that was like. And here in this comment, he says, I have been blessed It's almost like why have I been so blessed? Here's a beatitude. I have been blessed with a continual loss of capacity for independent functioning, forcing me to embrace my own insignificance in the great sea of humanity and creation. My life is fuller than I could have possibly imagined it could be when I was independent. We are all atoms of God's life, extraordinarily important to the whole, but not by ourselves. Diminishment of our sense of self-importance is the central focus of the spiritual life. The only thing that can separate us from each other and God's love is a decision not to accept that we belong with the lost, strayed, and injured. In fact, those for whom Jesus came. So being poor of spirit really places our reliance on God in a way that is quite joyful. We recognize how blessed we are. In Judaism, there is a term that is sometimes used to describe the, describe these, the Anawim. They are described as the poor. And the poor are particularly those who rely on God for everything. I have nothing of myself. I look to God to be the source of life and blessing and everything that I experience. We are the Anawim, those who are poor in spirit. In some ways, the first beatitude is sort of an umbrella that covers all of the other beatitudes, because for anyone who is truly poor in spirit, recognizing God as the source of life and all that we experience is going to live according to those other beatitudes as well. They flow from being poor in spirit. So let's look at the second one. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. One of the rich things about the Beatitudes and actually about many other aspects of Jesus' teaching is that they are not qualified in a very narrowing way. They have sort of a broad opening, a broad tent, if you will. So the Beatitude doesn't say, blessed are those who mourn because they are sick. Blessed are those who mourn because they are sinners. Blessed are those who mourn because they're in a pandemic. Any of those can apply, any of those reasons. And many interpreters will apply a particular reason for mourning. There are some who say we mourn because we recognize our sinfulness. We recognize our need for God, which connects it very closely with the first beatitude. Brendan Byrne talks about those who mourn, not doing so out of self-pity or a natural disposition to be sad. That's not at all what it's like. It's not an Eeyore beatitude. Oh, woe is me. Life is so hard. That's not what it means to be blessed as we are mourning. Oppressed by the present state of the world, they long for its liberation from poverty, injustice, violence, and disease. And we could add a whole list of things in our present world. Mourning because this is the situation in which we find ourselves. But that's not the totality. We mourn, again, placing our reliance on God, recognizing that our own energy, our own spirit, we unite with God to bring about some transformation. Dennis Ham says that Matthew's second beatitude is actually a variation of the first. Those who mourn is another description of Israel in need of God's help. We're poor in spirit, we mourn because of those things for which we definitely must rely on God. I mentioned the kind of broad possibilities in each of these beatitudes, that mourning might be for a very specific reason, or it might be something broader. It might be a personal or a communal or even a planetary reason for mourning. I found a particularly lovely description of joining in mourning by a ministry called the Arimathea Pallbearer Ministry. You may remember Joseph of Arimathea, the one who offered his tomb for Jesus. And he very tenderly cared for the body of Jesus as he was mourning over his death, and offered him this place of rest in the tomb. So this ministry, the Arimathea Pallbearer Ministry, developed for high school students. The description says the high school member would be a pallbearer when someone didn't have enough family or friends to serve as pallbearers. What it taught the author, remembering his experience, so that this author had done the pallbearer ministry when he was in high school, and it stayed with him well into his adult years. And he says that that ministry gave him an appreciation for life, empathy, how to console grieving family members. And then he wrote, "We were there to grieve with them and to respect the dead. We learned how to grieve the loss of someone we never knew, because each life is a unique gift worth celebrating." Joining in mourning for someone they didn't know. And certainly, I think we are drawn into that in this time in our world, grieving for people who have lost loved ones through the coronavirus, or through violence, through the effects of climate change. We can mourn with those people. And as we mourn, we can do something like these high school students to somehow be a source of comfort and community with those who mourn. I found that really moving to see how that stayed with him his whole life. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I'll just ask you this question. How many times have you just said, "Oh, that person is wonderful. He or she is so meek"? Is meekness a quality that we really admire and talk about and say, "Oh, meekness is something that our society really values"? Perhaps meekness, like being poor in spirit, is another one that needs a further discussion and development to understand what it really means. Meek, again from Brendan Byrne. Meek are not people who go around with head hung low. You know, the meek and mourning, they kind of might sound together like those Eeyore Beatitudes. They are not those who go around with head hung low, passively accepting and possibly seeking the role of victim. That's what we sometimes associate with being meek. They allow themselves to be abused. The Greek, praus, the word that is used there for meek, denotes a gentleness flowing from inner strength, the opposite of grasping. The meek do not have to have it all now at the expense of others. I found a really interesting and very helpful article. So this will be there on your page if you want to explore it further. It's by Brian Hodge, and it's simply called The Beatitudes, the Meek. And he talks about that word, prautes, that has a difficulty in translating, the same as understanding poor in spirit. He says it's not readily expressed in English. For the terms meekness, mildness, commonly used, suggest weakness and pusillanimity. I practiced saying that word. Pusillanimity, to a greater or less extent. that meekness manifested by the Lord and commended to the believer is the fruit of power. To be truly meek has an inner power. The common assumption is that when a man or woman is meek, it is because he or she cannot help themselves. But the Lord was meek, meek and humble of heart, because he had the infinite resources of God at his command. So to be truly meek, can you see how that does flow from being poor in spirit? We recognize that the power that we have doesn't come simply from my own inner strength, but that power comes from God. And my spirit, my power is united with that of God. So that meekness does not suggest weakness. Rather, it denotes strength brought under control. I think that's a beautiful way of understanding meekness, so that it is the opposite of allowing oneself to be abused, to be trampled upon, to be taking on a phony sense of lowliness, but rather to recognize where the power comes from. When we look at meekness, it's actually found in our relationships, both toward God and toward one another, recognizing that power, that grace, that beatitude that comes from God. The next one, all of them actually, but this one I think is a particularly significant one in our world today. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. In the Hebrew tradition, there are two words that often go together, tzedek or tzedekah and mishpat. And those two words together are often translated justice and righteousness, and they really have almost no difference in meaning. And when we use the word righteousness, some of your translations may say justice. It's important to understand that Hebrew background. It is not talking about this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of notion of justice that is part of our judicial system. So in the sermon, when Jesus relates righteousness or justice to life's most basic needs, it's related to food and water, hunger and thirst. The righteousness is most likely understood in terms of the Jewish tradition. And that is true, as we've already seen, in all of his teaching. It is rooted in how a Jewish audience would understand this terminology. So the term in the Hebrew scriptures, tzedekah or mishpat, let me put that because that also is often used when we're talking about justice. Tzedekah or mishpat refers to all of our good deeds, from almsgiving to visiting the sick, to self-sacrifice for the sake of the neighbor who is our brother or sister under God. Let me just stop there. If you see that definition or description of justice, doesn't that sound more like love or mercy or compassion? Well, in fact, there isn't really much of a distinction in how those words are used when it's talking about God's justice or mercy or compassion or love. And if that's the way God operates, those who hunger and thirst for justice do so in a similar way. Lapide goes on to say, neither broad-mindedness nor patronizing benevolence is involved here, but the fulfillment of a duty, something owed to fellow human beings as their rightful portion of the richness and unmerited gifts with which God showers the world. Everyone is entitled to justice. Justice is fundamentally bringing about that right relationship. Such a duty. So we have a duty to justice, a duty to all of these things. Such a duty cannot be discharged by mere well-wishing or lip service. Goodbye and good luck. Keep warm and well-fed. No, that is not what justice entails. Rather, justice, must be performed day after day. So seeking this, beatitude here. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, or who seek diligently. It must be performed day after day, always fresh, with a tireless joy in discovery, unwilling to sanction any status quo. It's a powerful beatitude that impels us to action. So this notion of justice, human righteousness or human justice, is patterned on God's own. And God's justice means God's creating, maintaining, and restoring right relationships. Justice has to do with bringing about right relationships in every dimension of life. And hungering and thirsting, we know what that feels like physically. So it means to be actively involved in bringing about this justice. Do you know, one of the things that might be helpful as you continue this reflection, go back over and read all of them, but particularly this one, and see how in particular your life is hungering and thirsting, is doing these things that are described here in this beatitude. The next, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Diane Bergant, in describing this as it's used in the lectionary reading, is that mercy is the disposition God has for sinners. Those who seek this attitude from God are exhorted to extend it to others. If God is merciful, then we too are called to be merciful. You know, one of the descriptions of mercy that is just one of the most beautiful, I think, is from The Merchant of Venice. You might know this, and if you want to say it along with me, we can do that. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It is an attribute of God himself. Of all of the things that the Beatitude says, I think that this part that says, it blesses him or her that gives and him or her that takes. That this beatitude of talking about being merciful, in being merciful, we are also blessed with mercy. There's something that is so freeing and liberating about this action of mercy, about giving God's own blessing of forgiveness and bounty to others. A word that is related to mercy in both English and Greek is certainly to forgive. That if we think of forgiveness, that the notion in the Greek New Testament is to forgive someone, is to offer release or liberty. That's certainly found in Luke's gospel, when Jesus says that he's come to bring good news to the poor, release to captives, liberty to those who are imprisoned. That's an action of mercy. And so mercy is releasing the one who offers mercy from holding on to anything, as well as mercy that is given to another. It blesses those who give and those who take. blessed are the pure of heart. You know, so many of these Beatitudes, I think, are often have sort of a limited notion. Pure of heart is so often used to preach about purity of body, purity of related to chastity. And it's not contrary to that, but that is certainly, the Beatitude means something much more than that. Those who are pure in heart, again from Brendan Bird, means those totally dedicated to God and God's cause, that it has a sense of fullness, much like holiness, a totality, dedicated to God and God's cause with no concealed loyalties or other allegiances on the side. He talks about it as single-mindedness of focus upon the Lord now will appropriately be rewarded with clarity of vision in the kingdom. Single-mindedness. Lawrence Cunningham says something similar when he says that the opposite of purity heart is being double-souled, you know, not just double-minded, but double-souled, dipskoi. In the New American Bible, it's translated as two minds, but it means to be being pulled in two directions. Purity of heart has that single-mindedness, single-souledness that focuses on God, the things of God, and somehow being a presence of God in the world. I realize we're going through these rather quickly, but you will have the recording and the page to look at again if you want to spend more time on each of these. The next one, blessed are the peacemakers. It just seems like each and every one of these Beatitudes has a particular importance in our world today. Peace means primarily an integral wholeness, the antithesis of schizophrenia and division. So, as in all of the Beatitudes, remember, Jesus as a Jew is teaching with that Jewish understanding, that Jewish background. So when he talks about peace, the notion of shalom in the Hebrew tradition would be in his understanding. Shalom. We translate it as peace, but more fully, it means harmony, wholeness, completeness, prosperity, welfare, and tranquility. All of those things are associated with the notion of shalom. So when we talk about being a peacemaker or living that beatitude of peace, as with the other Beatitudes, it's multifaceted. It has a lot of ways in which we can look at and experience it. So it means shalom with God, so that harmony, wholeness, completeness, etc. So shalom with God entails reconciliation, healing, and joy in God's presence. Being peacemakers means we also have shalom with others. And that can mean an end to hostilities, as well as averting war in the first place. You know, the better way to peace is not to sign a treaty at the end, but to avoid war or the hostilities, both individually and nationally. It also refers to socially just relationships between individuals and classes. So can you see how these Beatitudes are woven together? That those who are hungering and thirsting for justice are going to be involved in peacemaking. Another important dimension is to have shalom within oneself, a certain inner security arising from trust in God, that is, being poor in spirit, being pure of heart. So arising from trust in God with minds steadfastly set on the Lord, along with quietness of spirit, coming from right relationships, coming from justice. And then one that I think is particularly significant to think about in our world today is shalom with creation, with our environment. It means attentiveness and compassion on all of God's creation, both the living and the non-living, to bring about wholeness, completeness, prosperity, welfare, and tranquility on the world itself. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. This is a longer one, and maybe because it's so difficult to hear. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Notice something that happens here. All of the Beatitudes thus far have been in the third person, talking about those, they, he or she. Now, blessed are you, blessed are we. When people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you on my account, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. So there are actually two Beatitudes, aren't there here? Being persecuted and blessed when people revile us. So sharing in Jesus' lot, as Dennis Ham says, can only lead to sharing in his vindication. That this describes Jesus himself, doesn't it? Who was certainly persecuted as he lived and proclaimed justice and righteousness. And he too was reviled, even when he's on the cross. The promises embrace the full-time focus of the whole. The apocalyptic blessing, that final blessing, is grounded in a blessing already experienced. So we're not just saying, pie in the sky at the end times, but it's already experienced through contact with the kingdom, available through union with the risen Son of God, and with God's people. Brian Hodge goes on to talk about the different kinds of persecution that may be experienced. And I'll leave that there for you if you'd like to look at it a little bit more fully, because I want to talk just a little bit more before we have our discussion time. So these are the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. Luke also has Beatitudes, and I think I'll hold off on those and include those in next week's talk, even though they're on your handout, because I'd like to talk about a sermon that I heard on Beatitudes this summer at a funeral mass, and it was very powerful, and it might be something that you can use yourself. The gospel reading at the funeral was the Beatitudes, and after giving a really lovely full description of the Beatitudes, he went on to talk about the person for whose funeral we were gathered. His name was Terry. And the priest went on to say, Terry was a man of the Beatitudes. If Jesus were walking the earth today, he might well add a few Beatitudes to the list after he met Terry. So we saw those Beatitudes. But there are many others that could be added. So he went on to say, blessed are those who express gratitude. And we began our discussion today by talking about blessing and gratitude. And then he gave examples of how Terry exemplified that beatitude. Blessed are those who are loyal. And then he talked about how no matter how long ago he had met someone or that person had been a part of his life, he continued to regard them and to care for them. Blessed are those who are respectful of others. And he showed how in Terry's life, that was the way that he treated those who were close family and friends, as well as those he just met casually, was very respectful of their human dignity. And there were more. But I think that this can give us a little, maybe a template to start thinking about beatitude people that we meet. Maybe they are people that exemplify these beatitudes that we just talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, or maybe there are other ones, people whose present somehow is a blessing to ourselves and to others. Think about what those qualities are, what that blessedness is, and how we might have that be a part of our life as well. Brian Hodge also gives a nice summary of the Beatitudes there, and I'll just quickly read those as his summary, and then we can have some discussion in the last 15 minutes. So he starts off by saying they don't describe 8 different types of people to say, well, my beatitude is to be meek and forget about the rest. No, that they are to be one kind of person, a person who is a disciple with 8 particular traits. So the blessed realize their spiritual need, are genuinely sorry for their sins, humbly let God direct them, greatly desire a right relationship with God, are merciful to others, are not double-minded but pure in heart, are peacemakers, are ready and willing to suffer for the cause of Christ. And what I would add is simply this, and my favorite word, because this is certainly a good foundation to talk about the Beatitudes. And what we talked about today, I think, is also simply a foundation. Because as I mentioned, Jesus isn't limiting these to one kind of person, to one particular circumstance, but they have a broad application for every moment of life. So what I'm going to do now is stop the screen sharing so that we can have some conversation. And objections, corrections, additions, subtractions, anything that perhaps one that struck you as a particularly relevant one, either for yourself or for our world today. Oh, and here's just a comment too on the chat. I love the NPR In Memoriam, where they recount the lives of those we have lost to COVID. And that's where blessed are those who mourn. We mourn for them, with their families, with those who have lost loved ones. So yeah, that's a really kind of a nice broad way that we are invited to engage with others who have lost loved ones. Carolyn's iPad has a raised hand.
Hi. You've said this in so many ways, but it just really struck me last week when you talked about how the Beatitudes are not just about an individual. They're really about what enables us to live in community. And it's been helpful to think about that this week when we're so anxious over the election and and what's been happening in Portland and our country. So it's been really eye-opening to me, to heart-opening really, to think in that way of how can we that's a bad word, but incorporate those Beatitudes into community. I feel that Westminster personifies that for me.
And it certainly has personified it to me too. I would say a beatitude for me are blessed are those who are able to participate in Westminster's community, because you do exemplify the Beatitudes. That brings to mind something that my sister suggested doing, is to have a family mission statement. I know churches have mission statements, but even families can have mission statements. And to think of a family making a mission statement that is based on the Beatitudes. How are we as a family? And it doesn't have to just be the nuclear family, but maybe broader relationships, maybe your neighborhood. A neighborhood mission statement that this is how we exemplify these Beatitudes together. Oh, thank you, Carolyn. Other comments, questions, insights? Yes, Jackie.
I thought as you were talking of our friend Jeannie Darcher, who died about 2 weeks ago, and then we were thinking about today. And it was, blessed are they who bring joy, because that's certainly how I experienced Jeannie.
Oh, wonderful. And that is such a great thing to do, is to add a beatitude for a particular person or even for a particular community. You know, this is a beatitude for Westminster or for Jeannie, did you say a particular? Blessed is she who brings joy. Yeah, thank you. So sometimes it takes some time to process things and to think about, is there some particular way that you want to think about the Beatitudes? And one of the things too, remember that when we look at them, we can say, this is a description of myself. And rather than making it a statement, make it a question. Am I poor in spirit? Or make it plural. Are we poor in spirit? So make it both a question form and a plural form. That might be a way of a little bit of a catalyst, so that it's not just, oh, I learned something interesting, but rather a catalyst for living, for a way of actually exemplifying the Beatitudes.
I see a comment that Linda Buckley wrote. It says, appropriate discussion for All Saints Day today.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if you have the same lectionary. Do you have a set lectionary for your Sunday readings? Because the gospel for today is the Beatitudes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So it is a perfect way, because the saints, whether they are recognized or someone that we just know as a saint, are those who show us what beatitude life looks like.
And Beth is preaching on that today.
Pardon?
Beth is preaching on that today.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. So there'll be some additions. So there are so many different ways of reflecting on the Beatitudes. So can be individual, communal. The Beatitudes also a portrait of Jesus. Jesus, meek and humble of heart. Jesus, who hungered and thirsted for justice. All of those attitudes that, if we want to know what that looks like, we look at Jesus himself. I love All Saints Day. Do you know St. Mary Clausen? That's my mother.
Oh.
It's her feast day today.
Yeah. Elaine, I think so much of this comes down to humility, it seems to me, that basic humility. Each one of these Beatitudes in one way or another points to humility. And so many of the forces in contemporary society push us away from humility, and particularly for, I would say, especially for men, in my experience.
Thank you. And you know, you just, I think, confirmed what I said about that first beatitude, the poor in spirit. That's an umbrella over all of them, because that is that basic stance of humility before God and one another. You know, that we recognize that I am not the center of the universe, and that God is the one who has given us everything and invites us, empowers us to live that same empowerment. Am I seeing a hand here? Or is that, no, that's just looking at an iPad or something. Yes. Oh, can't see your name.
I'm Beverly.
Beverly.
I have a question on how to live into the fullness of this. It's not new information to me, but it's so easy when we just read scripture or refer to it to just see it in the old ways and the really short and cryptic words that are there. and you add such a fullness of depth and meaning. And how do we hold that in referring to the Bible, Jesus's ways, or God's intentions, or anything else? How do we keep expressing the fullness that you have put out there for us?
I wish that I could say I do it myself really well every day. How can we do it? How can we apply it to our everyday lives? I think you have that wisdom. How do you apply it to your everyday lives? It's both a question and a prayer.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways that, it's certainly not an answer to everything, but for me, it's really important to begin the day with prayer and to know that I'm not going to make it through this time that for me is so stressful, horrific, with all of the things that are going on in our country, on our planet. And so it has to be the day beginning with prayer. And very often there will be some little inkling, just a little glimmer that says, this is something for today. Sometimes it's just a word. Very often the prayer is based on whatever the daily readings are for that day, or something that I've read or heard that inspires me. But I think that that's a starting point to pray always. We are not at every moment consciously praying, but if we start the day with prayer, that is a good way to begin, and it can open up our eyes. The other is consciously developing an attitude or practice of attentiveness to what's going on around us and within us. Attentiveness to, is there someone in my family, in my neighborhood, in my faith community, my workplace, who's calling out to me in some way, being attentive there, being attentive to what's going on both within myself and outside. And that can also sometimes give us a particular direction. Even though we've said, certainly where the Beatitudes are set forth for us that we live all of them, but I know that there are certain times when one of them is much more powerfully important in my life. Times when I feel impelled to act for peace and to be a peacemaker, maybe a source of reconciliation with a family conflict, or maybe I notice some injustice in that particular beatitude. I'm being impelled because I've been attentive to what's going on, being impelled to respond to that issue. So prayer, attentiveness, and certainly the two of them go together. Yes, I see a hand.
I think sometimes it's a matter of showing up and not understanding how it's going to turn out in the end, not having all the answers, but just being with someone else. It's hard to do now, but we can do it in other ways.
Yes.
But just showing up is important. Blessed
Absolutely. Showing up. Yeah. And I like that people that talked about your porch way of being with neighbors. We find new ways of showing up. We're showing up with each other this morning, even though we can't, this is the only way we can hug, but we're still together. So showing up is, and that's actually God's name, the God of showing up. I am with you. That's who God is. Yes, Jackie.
Is there one of these characteristics that you would say speaks to our stress and anxiety in the current situation of our country and our next week?
I wish I had a quick, easy answer, but I think it always goes back to that first one. That first beatitude is that though we are engaged and we do everything we can, we know that ultimately it's not all about what I do. And I have to put some reliance on God and God's people. And working together with other people is, you know, a part of it, but I have to sometimes just let go and say, I am not in charge of the universe, even though I act like I am sometimes.
We're coming close to the end of the hour. Are there some things that you want to prime us, Elaine, for what you want to do next week?
Yes, well, on your handout, I took away the screen share, but I did have some suggestions there. Whoops. So reflect on any of the Beatitudes. How do you see them as a portrait of Jesus, of the church, of yourself? Is any one particularly important? Why? What new Beatitudes do you experience? And maybe you can think this week, notice someone who exemplifies a Beatitude, either one that's in the sermon or another one that you've noticed. We saw someone suggested Beatitude of joy. Blessed are the joyful. Blessed are the whoever. And what I also suggested is put it as a question. Am I this person? Are we? And how can we do it more fully? And then just let God's own spirit inspire any other possibilities. Next week, we're going to do Beatitudes beyond the Sermon on the Mount, both in Luke, well, particularly in Luke's gospel, and then beyond. Stay tuned. Thank you so much. You are just such a Beatitude people, and I feel really privileged to spend time with you. So thank you for all of you.
All right. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, thank you. I love being with you. I hope you have a wonderful All Saints Day. Happy Feast Day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.